They said the Alpha King had no heart, but the truth was far more frightening. He had simply buried it so deeply that no one had lived long enough to see it beat. Long before dawn painted the mountains with silver light, the carriage carrying Evelyn Carter rolled across the ancient stone bridge leading into Blackstone Kingdom. The wooden wheels echoed softly beneath her, while cold autumn air slipped through the narrow window and brushed against her face. She pulled her worn gray cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to quiet the nervous rhythm of her heartbeat. Beyond the bridge, towering black pines stretched toward the pale sky, surrounding a kingdom whispered about across every werewolf territory in the north. Children stopped playing whenever travelers spoke its name. Merchants lowered their voices. Elders looked toward the moon before offering prayers. Blackstone was the home of Alpha King Caleb Thornridge, the ruler every pack respected and every stranger feared. Evelyn had heard the stories since she was a little girl sitting beside her grandmother's fireplace. They called him the Winter King because his expression never changed. They said he had never laughed during a celebration, never smiled at a royal banquet, never shed a single tear even when those closest to him disappeared from his life. Some claimed he had forgotten what love felt like years ago. Others insisted he had never known it at all. As the carriage approached the city gates, the guards stepped aside without speaking, their polished armor catching the first rays of sunrise. The gates opened slowly with a deep groan, revealing streets already alive with merchants arranging baskets of apples, fresh bread, pumpkins, and colorful autumn flowers. Yet as soon as people noticed the royal carriage, conversations faded into silence. Faces turned toward the window where Evelyn sat hidden behind thin curtains. She could feel their eyes following every movement, even though no one could clearly see her. A little girl tugged gently on her mother's sleeve and whispered something too quiet for Evelyn to hear. The woman answered with a sad smile before pulling her daughter closer. Two elderly women paused beside a fountain. One slowly shook her head. A young blacksmith removed his cap as the carriage passed, not out of celebration but sympathy. Their expressions confused Evelyn more than they frightened her. She had expected curiosity. She had expected excitement. Instead, every face carried the same quiet sorrow. When the carriage stopped near the palace courtyard, the driver climbed down and opened the door. Before Evelyn could step onto the stone path, an older maid hurried toward her. Her silver hair was neatly tied beneath a simple white bonnet, and kindness softened the lines around her eyes. She offered Evelyn a careful hand. "Lady Carter," she said gently, "my name is Margaret. I have served this palace for 31 years. Evelyn smiled politely as she stepped down. "It's nice to meet you." Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the towering palace before lowering her voice. "May I offer one piece of advice?" Evelyn nodded. "Of course." The older woman folded her hands together as though choosing every word with great care. "Do not mistake His Majesty's silence for hatred, and do not wait for warmth that may never come." Evelyn searched the woman's face. "Is he truly as cold as everyone says?" Margaret looked away toward the highest tower where black banners moved gently in the morning breeze. "The kingdom has survived because our king carries every burden himself." Somewhere along the way, people stopped looking for the man beneath the crown. Before Evelyn could ask another question, bells echoed across the palace grounds. Servants straightened immediately. Soldiers stood motionless. Even birds seemed to scatter from the rooftops. Margaret quietly stepped aside. "He's coming." Evelyn instinctively turned toward the grand staircase leading to enormous oak doors trimmed with silver. The doors opened slowly. A tall figure emerged, dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat that moved softly with the autumn wind. His dark hair reflected faint shades of midnight beneath the morning sun, and his posture was calm, effortless, almost impossibly still. He descended each step without haste, his silver eyes fixed somewhere beyond the gathering crowd. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt the silence surrounding him. Evelyn had imagined meeting a monster shaped by terrifying legends. Instead, she saw a man carrying a loneliness so quiet it seemed to follow him like a second shadow. For just a single heartbeat, before his gaze reached hers, she found herself wondering whether everyone had misunderstood the story from the very beginning. Caleb Thornridge stopped 3 steps before reaching her, leaving a respectful distance that felt both deliberate and impossible to ignore. The palace courtyard remained perfectly silent, as though every servant had forgotten how to breathe. Evelyn lowered her head in a graceful bow, her hands folded neatly before her. When she looked up again, the Alpha King was studying her with calm silver eyes that revealed nothing at all. There was no curiosity, no excitement, no disappointment. His expression resembled the quiet surface of a frozen lake, impossible to read and impossible to disturb. "Lady Evelyn Carter," he said at last. His voice was deep, steady, and surprisingly gentle despite its reserved tone. "Welcome to Blackstone." She offered a polite smile. "Thank you, Your Majesty." He gave a single nod. "I hope your journey was comfortable." It was. A brief silence settled between them. Evelyn searched for another question, another greeting, anything that might bridge the invisible distance standing between them. But Caleb simply stepped aside and extended one hand toward the palace entrance. "Breakfast has been prepared. You must be tired." That was all. No elaborate welcome. No ceremony. No attempt to impress her. Just quiet courtesy wrapped inside perfect control. As they walked through the enormous entrance hall, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, covering polished marble floors with ribbons of blue, crimson, and gold. Portraits of former Alpha Kings lined the walls, their painted eyes following every visitor who passed beneath them. Servants bowed deeply as Caleb walked by. He acknowledged each one with a small nod, but never slowed his pace. Evelyn noticed something unusual. Every servant looked at him with complete respect, yet none appeared frightened. They simply understood his silence and never demanded more from him than he willingly offered. Breakfast was served in a dining room large enough to host an entire royal council. Yet only 2 places had been prepared at one end of the long oak table. Fresh bread rested beside warm butter. Bowls of berries, honey, scrambled eggs, roasted potatoes, and sliced apples filled silver platters. The aroma reminded Evelyn of quiet mornings with her grandmother before life had become complicated. Caleb waited until she was seated before taking his own chair across from her. "Please eat while everything is still warm," he said. Evelyn thanked him softly and reached for a piece of bread. She expected conversation to follow, but only the gentle sound of silverware touching porcelain filled the room. At first she assumed he was giving her time to recover from the journey. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Caleb ate with calm precision, occasionally taking a sip of coffee while gazing toward the tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens. He never seemed uncomfortable with silence. In fact, he appeared completely at home inside it. Finally, Evelyn decided she could not spend the entire meal wondering what he was thinking. "The gardens are beautiful," she said. Caleb looked toward her. "My mother planted the first roses there many years ago." His answer surprised her. She had not expected him to volunteer something personal. Encouraged, she smiled. Did she enjoy gardening? His eyes drifted briefly back toward the window. Very much. The conversation ended there. Not because he wished to be rude, Evelyn realized, but because he rarely used more words than he believed necessary. There was an honesty to his restraint that felt strangely unfamiliar. Most nobles she had met filled every silence with speeches meant to impress. Caleb never seemed interested in impressing anyone. When breakfast ended, he stood and gently placed his napkin beside his plate. "Margaret will show you your rooms. If you require anything, you only need to ask." Evelyn hesitated. "Will I see you again today?" For the first time since they met, Caleb paused before answering. His silver eyes rested on her with quiet consideration. Yes. It was only one word, yet something about the way he said it carried certainty rather than obligation. He inclined his head politely before leaving the dining room. His footsteps faded into the distant corridors until complete silence returned. Margaret appeared almost immediately, offering Evelyn a sympathetic smile. "Do not take it personally." Evelyn looked toward the doorway where Caleb had disappeared. "Does everyone believe he dislikes them?" Margaret chuckled softly. "Every guest believes that during their first week. And after that," the older woman folded her hands together, "they begin noticing the things His Majesty never speaks about." Evelyn frowned thoughtfully, such as, Margaret's eyes wandered toward the window overlooking the palace grounds where gardeners carefully watered late autumn flowers. The firewood that appears at poor families' homes before the first snowfall. The medicine delivered to villages without anyone asking who paid for it. The scholarships for orphan children. The repaired bridges after every storm. Evelyn blinked. The king does all that. Margaret smiled, but did not answer directly. Instead, she opened the door leading toward the private royal residence. Some people announce kindness with speeches. Others simply make sure no one goes without what they need. As Evelyn followed her through the quiet hallway, she glanced once more toward the distant wing where Caleb had vanished. The story she had heard her entire life suddenly felt incomplete, as though the kingdom had spent years describing winter without ever mentioning that beneath frozen ground, spring quietly waited for the right season to return. 3 days passed with the same quiet rhythm, and Evelyn slowly discovered that Blackstone Palace seemed to move according to Caleb Thornridge's footsteps even when he was nowhere to be seen. Every morning the servants began their work before sunrise. Every afternoon the royal council gathered inside the Western Hall. Every evening the palace settled into peaceful silence as lanterns illuminated long stone corridors with warm golden light. Yet despite sharing the same home, Evelyn and Caleb rarely crossed paths for more than a few minutes. Whenever they did, he greeted her with the same calm courtesy, asked whether she had everything she needed, listened carefully to her answer, and then disappeared into another responsibility waiting somewhere beyond the palace walls. It would have been easy to believe he simply wished to keep his distance if not for the small details that kept appearing around her almost every day. The embroidery frame she admired during breakfast quietly appeared in her sitting room that afternoon. A collection of novels written by her favorite poets arrived the following morning without a note. When Margaret casually mentioned that Evelyn preferred chamomile tea over black tea, every evening tray afterward carried a fresh steaming pot of chamomile before she even requested it. No one announced these gestures. No servant claimed credit. Whenever Evelyn politely asked who had arranged them, they all answered with the same gentle smile before changing the subject. One crisp afternoon, Margaret invited her to walk through the palace gardens while the last roses of the season still bloomed. The air smelled of pine trees and fresh earth after an early morning rain, and tiny birds fluttered between hedges trimmed with remarkable care. As they rounded a quiet stone path, Evelyn noticed an elderly groundskeeper struggling to lift a heavy wooden planter. Before she could offer help, another figure approached from the opposite direction. Caleb had exchanged his royal coat for a simple dark jacket that looked almost ordinary compared to the clothing he wore during official meetings. Without speaking, he rolled up his sleeves and lifted the planter as though it weighed almost nothing. The elderly gardener smiled gratefully, saying something too soft for Evelyn to hear. Caleb answered with a faint nod and waited until the planter rested safely beneath a young maple tree before continuing down the path. He never noticed Evelyn watching from behind a row of white roses. Later that evening, she wandered toward the palace library, hoping to borrow another novel before dinner. Passing an open doorway, she heard quiet voices drifting from inside a small meeting room. Instinctively, she slowed her steps. A village physician stood before Caleb with several folded reports spread across a table. The northern clinic is running low on supplies, the physician admitted. The harvest was smaller than expected. Caleb studied the papers only briefly before replying in his steady voice. Send everything they requested tonight. Double the shipment before the first snowfall. No family should choose between heat and medicine. The physician looked relieved. Should the records list the royal treasury? Caleb shook his head. List the village council instead. They have enough worries without feeling indebted. Evelyn quietly stepped away before either man noticed her standing there. Her heart felt strangely heavy, not with sadness, but with the realization that Margaret had been telling the truth. The kingdom celebrated Caleb as a strong ruler, yet no one seemed to know how often he quietly carried burdens without asking for recognition. That realization stayed with her through dinner, through sunset, and long after the palace had fallen asleep. Near midnight, she woke after hearing faint footsteps outside her room. Curious, she opened the door just enough to see into the hallway. Caleb walked alone beneath rows of lanterns, already dressed for travel despite the late hour. A captain of the royal guard approached him holding several maps. Your Majesty, the Eastern Mountain Road is still unsafe after the storm. Caleb accepted the map with a calm expression. Then we leave immediately. The bridge must be inspected before sunrise. Farmers will begin using it in the morning. You could send someone else, the captain suggested carefully. Caleb folded the map. If I expect others to stand in the cold, I should be willing to stand beside them. The two men disappeared into the darkness beyond the archway. Evelyn remained quietly at her doorway long after their footsteps faded. She had arrived believing she would spend her days beside a king who had forgotten compassion. Instead, she kept discovering pieces of a man who hid kindness so deeply that even those who benefited from it rarely realized whose hands had changed their lives. For the first time since entering Blackstone Kingdom, she found herself hoping that one day he might trust someone enough to stop carrying every burden alone. The following afternoon brought the first snowfall of the season, light enough to dust the palace rooftops without covering the gardens below. Evelyn stood beside the tall library window, watching white flakes drift lazily through the air while servants hurried across the courtyard carrying baskets of firewood. Blackstone looked quieter beneath fresh snow, almost as though the entire kingdom had paused to listen to the changing season. She had nearly finished another novel when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Margaret stepped inside with a gentle smile. His Majesty asked whether you might enjoy walking through the winter greenhouse before dinner. Evelyn looked up in surprise. He asked. Margaret nodded. He remembered you admired the gardens. A few minutes later, Evelyn found Caleb waiting outside the glass conservatory with his hands folded behind his back. As always, his expression remained composed, yet there was something less distant about him than before. Good afternoon, he said. I hope I am not interrupting your reading. She smiled warmly. Not at all. Margaret said you invited me here. I thought the flowers deserved to be seen before winter settles in. Together they entered the enormous greenhouse where warm air immediately replaced the cold outside. Rows of blooming orchids, roses, lilies, and jasmine filled the space with gentle fragrance, while sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling and painted soft patterns across the stone paths. For several minutes, they simply walked without speaking. This time, however, the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, like two people sharing the same quiet moment without needing to explain it. Evelyn stopped beside a blooming white camellia. My grandmother loved these flowers, she said. She always believed they reminded people that kindness could survive every season. Caleb looked at the delicate blossoms before answering. My mother believed the same thing. Evelyn turned toward him. Margaret told me she planted the first roses. A faint warmth softened his eyes. She believed a kingdom should always have something beautiful waiting for those who carried heavy hearts. Evelyn smiled. She sounds remarkable. Caleb nodded slowly. She was. They continued walking until they reached a small wooden bench beneath climbing vines. Snow tapped gently against the glass overhead, while birds sheltered among the branches inside the warm conservatory. Caleb remained standing for a moment before quietly taking a seat. Evelyn joined him. For the first time since arriving, neither of them seemed eager to fill the silence or escape it. After several peaceful moments, Caleb spoke again. Have you been comfortable here? Very much. She hesitated before adding. Everyone has been incredibly thoughtful. He inclined his head slightly. I am glad. Evelyn looked toward the snow beyond the glass walls. May I ask you something? Of course. Why do people believe you are so cold? Caleb remained quiet long enough that she wondered whether she had overstepped. Finally, he answered without irritation or defensiveness. Perhaps because I have given them very little reason to believe otherwise. But you help people every day. His gaze rested on the falling snow. Helping is part of my responsibility, not the way you do it. Caleb smiled so faintly that anyone standing farther away might have missed it completely. Recognition has never repaired a bridge or filled an empty pantry. Evelyn lowered her eyes, remembering the medicine, the firewood, the anonymous generosity she had quietly discovered over the past week. Then why hide it? He took a slow breath before answering. Because kindness offered for applause is no longer entirely kindness. The words lingered between them long after he finished speaking. Evelyn realized that everything she had believed about strength was quietly changing. She had expected courage to sound loud, commanding, impossible to ignore. Instead, it sat beside her wearing a simple black coat, speaking softly enough that many people would never hear it. As dusk approached, they left the greenhouse together and walked back toward the palace entrance. Halfway across the courtyard, a young stable boy rushed toward Caleb, clearly nervous. Your Majesty, I am sorry. One of the delivery wagons broke an axle outside the south gate. Caleb did not sigh or show frustration. Was anyone injured? No, sir. Good. Tell the kitchen to send hot soup for the drivers. They will be cold by now. I will meet the repair crew in a few minutes. The boy's anxious face immediately relaxed. Yes, Your Majesty. He hurried away with renewed confidence. Evelyn watched the exchange quietly before looking back at Caleb. You always ask about people before the problem. Caleb seemed almost puzzled by the observation. Is there another order that makes sense? Before she could answer, he gave her a respectful nod. Dinner will be served at 7. I may be late. Then he walked toward the palace gates where workers already waited in the gathering twilight. Evelyn remained beneath the softly falling snow, watching his figure disappear beyond the stone walls, and for the first time she realized she was no longer trying to understand the Alpha King everyone feared. She was beginning to understand the lonely man almost no one had truly taken the time to know. Nearly 2 weeks after Evelyn arrived at Blackstone Palace, winter tightened its grip across the Northern Territory. Snow rested on rooftops like folded blankets. Smoke curled from chimneys throughout the villages, and the kingdom settled into the steady rhythm of preparing for the coldest months of the year. One quiet morning, as Evelyn finished breakfast, hurried footsteps echoed through the entrance hall. A messenger covered in melting snow bowed deeply before Caleb and several members of the royal council. Your Majesty, he said between careful breaths, a fever has spread through the settlements along the eastern border. The village clinic is already full, and more families are arriving every hour. The council chamber fell silent. One advisor unfolded a map, while another began calculating how many physicians could travel before nightfall. Caleb listened without interruption, his expression calm despite the concern in every voice surrounding him. Prepare additional medicine. He instructed. Send blankets, clean water, and enough food for every household. No village will face this alone. Evelyn remained quietly near the doorway, watching the meeting unfold. She noticed that Caleb never asked how much the relief effort would cost. He only asked how quickly it could reach those who needed it. As the council dispersed, she stepped forward. May I come with the medical team? Caleb looked at her with immediate surprise. The journey will be difficult. I know. The weather is becoming harsher by the hour. She smiled gently. People will still need help whether the weather is kind or not. Caleb remained silent for several long moments. Finally, he answered in the same steady voice he always used. There are already experienced physicians traveling. Then I will assist them. You are not expected to. Evelyn met his eyes without hesitation. Perhaps not, but I would rather be useful than comfortable. Something unreadable flickered across Caleb's face before disappearing almost instantly. The clinics may become crowded, he said quietly. You could become exhausted. Then I will rest afterward. He looked away briefly toward the snow falling beyond the palace windows, as though carefully weighing every possibility. I would prefer that you remain here. Evelyn understood the concern hidden beneath those carefully chosen words, yet she also understood the faces she had seen in nearby villages during recent visits with Margaret. Families depended upon one another through every difficult season. Turning away now would never feel right. Please, she said softly. If I can comfort even one frightened child or carry one basket of supplies, then I should go. Caleb studied her for another quiet moment before releasing a slow breath. Very well. His voice remained composed, but there was unmistakable reluctance behind it. You will stay with the physicians at all times. I promise. If they tell you to rest, you will listen. Her smile grew warmer. I promise that as well. Before she left the chamber, Caleb added one final sentence. Return before nightfall if conditions worsen. The journey to the eastern villages took several hours. Through snow-covered roads bordered by tall pine forests. Despite the freezing air outside, the temporary medical shelters were filled with warmth, determined volunteers, and neighbors helping one another however they could. Evelyn spent the day carrying fresh water, preparing warm meals, comforting anxious children while their parents received treatment, and organizing blankets for elderly residents. She never attempted to replace the physicians. Instead, she quietly filled every small need that allowed them to focus on their patients. As daylight faded, another supply wagon finally arrived after struggling through heavy snow. While several workers unloaded crates of medicine, Evelyn noticed an elderly woman standing alone beside the road, shivering inside a thin wool shawl. Without hesitation, she removed her own heavier winter cloak and gently wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. "You need this more than I do," Evelyn said with a reassuring smile. The woman tried to refuse, but Evelyn simply squeezed her hand and encouraged her toward the warming tent. From a short distance away, Caleb had just arrived with another convoy of supplies after personally inspecting the mountain roads. He had intended to order everyone back before the weather became more dangerous, but his steps slowed as he watched Evelyn helping strangers with the same quiet kindness she had shown since arriving at Blackstone. She had not come seeking praise. She had not even realized he was there. She simply continued moving from one family to another, offering encouragement wherever she found fear. Caleb felt an unfamiliar weight settle inside his chest, one that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the woman who seemed unable to ignore another person's suffering. Then a physician approached him with growing concern. "Your Majesty," the man said carefully, "Lady Evelyn has been working since early morning without stopping. She insists she feels fine, but she has begun coughing, and the weather is becoming much colder. I believe she needs to return to the palace before the storm grows worse." Caleb's eyes immediately found Evelyn across the snowy square, still smiling as she handed a steaming cup of broth to a frightened little girl, completely unaware that the first signs of exhaustion had already begun to appear. Caleb crossed the snowy square without hesitation, his long strides carrying him through the growing storm until he reached Evelyn just as she handed the empty cup back to the little girl. Up close, he could see the color had faded from her face, and despite her gentle smile, her breathing had become noticeably slower. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "it is time to go home." She looked at him with mild surprise. "There are still families waiting for blankets. Others will finish distributing them." She shook her head with a soft laugh that ended in a light cough. "I'm all right. I only need a few more minutes." Caleb's expression remained calm, but his voice grew firmer than she had ever heard before. "No, you have done enough." Before she could protest again, the physician approached, carrying a small leather case. "Lady Evelyn," he said gently, "please allow us to examine you once we return to the palace. The fever spreading through the village has been exhausting even the healthiest volunteers." Evelyn nodded politely, still believing her weariness came from a long day in the cold. She offered one last reassuring smile to the nearby families before allowing Caleb to escort her toward the waiting carriage. The ride back to Blackstone Palace was unusually quiet. Snow tapped softly against the carriage windows while the horses pulled steadily through the dark forest road. Evelyn rested her head against the seat, closing her eyes for only a moment. Caleb noticed immediately. "Are you cold?" he asked. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Only a little." Without another word, he removed his own heavy winter cloak and carefully placed it across her shoulders. "You will need this more than I will." She started to object. "But you will be outside when we arrive. I have walked through colder nights." There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to appear heroic. He simply adjusted the edge of the cloak to keep the winter air from reaching her before looking back toward the snowy road ahead. Evelyn felt unexpected warmth that had very little to do with the thick wool resting around her shoulders. By the time they reached the palace, lanterns glowed across every hallway. Margaret hurried forward the moment the carriage stopped. One look at Evelyn's tired face erased the welcoming smile she had prepared. "Your Majesty," she whispered anxiously, "she does not look well." Caleb gently offered Evelyn his arm as they climbed the front steps. Normally she would have declined, insisting she could walk perfectly well on her own. This time she accepted without argument. Her balance felt strangely uncertain. Within minutes the palace physician arrived and completed a careful examination while Caleb remained quietly near the window, saying almost nothing. The physician finally stood and folded his hands. "She has developed a serious fever from prolonged exposure to the cold while caring for others. She must remain warm and rest completely for the next several days. If the fever continues to rise overnight, we will need to monitor her constantly." Margaret immediately began preparing herbal tea while servants added fresh logs to the fireplace. Evelyn attempted a reassuring smile. "I am sorry for causing everyone so much concern." Caleb turned toward her. His silver eyes rested on her with unmistakable seriousness. "You have caused no inconvenience." She lowered her gaze. "I only wanted to help." He stepped a little closer, his voice quieter than before. "You did help. More than you realize." For a brief moment neither of them spoke. Outside, snow continued falling across the silent kingdom, covering every rooftop in white. Inside the warm room, the fire crackled gently, yet Caleb found himself unable to ignore the growing uneasiness settling deep within him. He had spent years carrying the worries of an entire kingdom without allowing fear to reach his face. But as he watched Evelyn struggle to remain awake despite insisting she was fine, a thought quietly entered his mind that refused to leave. For the first time in many years, he wished duty alone could guarantee that someone precious would be safe. Morning arrived without bringing the improvement everyone had hoped for. Soft winter light filtered through the bedroom curtains, yet Evelyn remained asleep, her breathing slow as the palace physician quietly checked her condition once again. Margaret stood near the fireplace with folded hands, whispering one hopeful prayer after another while fresh herbs simmered in a kettle nearby. The physician finally looked toward Caleb, who had not left the room since the previous evening. "Her fever has not broken," he said carefully. "We must continue keeping her comfortable and give her body time to recover." Caleb acknowledged the report with a silent nod, but he did not move from the chair beside Evelyn's bed. Official documents waited unopened on a nearby table. Council members quietly postponed meetings without complaint. Every messenger who entered the room received calm instructions before leaving again. The kingdom continued to function, yet its king remained exactly where he believed he was needed most. Hour after hour passed in quiet patience. Whenever Margaret adjusted the blankets, Caleb thanked her. Whenever the physician requested fresh water or clean towels, they appeared almost immediately because Caleb had already anticipated the need. He spoke little, but he noticed everything. As evening settled over Blackstone Palace, several senior advisors gathered outside the bedroom door, hoping to persuade their king to rest for a few hours. One elderly council member cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty, the physicians will remain with her through the night. You have not slept." Caleb looked toward the closed window where snow continued falling beneath the moonlight. "Neither has she." The advisor lowered his eyes, unable to argue with such a simple answer. One by one, they quietly withdrew, leaving only Margaret inside the room. She approached Caleb with a warm cup of tea. "Please," she said softly. "Even the strongest heart needs strength." Caleb accepted the cup out of respect, taking only a small sip before setting it aside untouched. His attention returned immediately to Evelyn. Her face appeared peaceful despite the fever, but seeing her so still unsettled him in ways he had never experienced before. He remembered the first morning she had entered Blackstone with quiet courage despite every frightening rumor she had heard. He remembered her laughing gently inside the greenhouse, speaking about flowers that survived every season. He remembered her giving away her own winter cloak without a second thought, because someone else needed warmth more than she did. None of those memories had seemed extraordinary while they happened. Together, they now formed something impossible to ignore. Late that night, Evelyn stirred slightly, as though trying to wake, but the effort faded almost immediately. Without thinking, Caleb reached forward and carefully took her hand between both of his. It felt cooler than he wished it would. His carefully guarded composure finally began to crack beneath the weight of helplessness. For years he had believed every problem could be answered with discipline, responsibility, or sacrifice. Yet sitting beside her, he discovered there were moments when authority meant nothing at all. His voice became almost a whisper. "You have spent every day thinking of everyone except yourself." He gently lowered his head, never releasing her hand. "Now allow someone to think of you." The room remained completely silent except for the quiet crackling of the fire. A single tear slipped down his cheek before he realized it had fallen. Then another followed. Margaret looked up in stunned disbelief from across the room. During 3 decades inside Blackstone Palace, she had watched Caleb Thornridge carry loss, hardship, and responsibility without ever allowing sorrow to reach his face. Yet tonight there was no Alpha King sitting beside the bed, no distant ruler wrapped in perfect control. There was only a man silently praying that the woman who had brought warmth back into his quiet world would open her eyes again. Early the next morning, the storm finally began to fade. Pale sunlight slipped through the frost-covered windows, filling the room with a gentle glow that had been absent for days. The palace remained unusually quiet, as though every servant, every guard, and every guest understood that hope itself was resting behind the closed bedroom door. Caleb had never left his place beside Evelyn. His royal coat rested across the back of the chair, untouched since the previous night. Official letters remained stacked neatly on the nearby table, waiting for signatures that no longer seemed important. His fingers still gently held Evelyn's hand, unwilling to let go even for a moment. The palace physician entered quietly with Margaret, carrying fresh herbal tea and another bowl of cool water. He approached the bedside and carefully checked Evelyn's forehead before pausing. His expression changed ever so slightly. Margaret noticed it immediately. "What is it?" she whispered. The physician smiled for the first time in 2 days. "Her fever is beginning to fall." Margaret covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Caleb looked toward the physician, almost afraid to believe the words he had just heard. "Are you certain?" The physician nodded. "She is not fully recovered yet, but her body is finally responding. This is a very encouraging sign." Relief swept silently across the room. No one celebrated loudly. No one wished to disturb the peaceful stillness surrounding Evelyn. They simply allowed themselves to breathe again. An hour passed, then another. Outside, snow slowly melted from the palace rooftops beneath the warming sunlight. Birds returned to the gardens, their soft songs drifting through the slightly open window. Caleb remained exactly where he had been, quietly watching for even the smallest change. Then, almost too gently to notice, Evelyn's fingers moved within his hand. He looked down immediately. Her eyelashes fluttered once. Then again. Slowly, her eyes opened. The morning light reflected softly in them as she looked around the unfamiliar silence before her gaze finally settled on Caleb. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. She seemed surprised to find him sitting there, his eyes tired from sleepless nights, his hand still wrapped around hers. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You stayed." Caleb closed his eyes for a single heartbeat before answering. "Of course." Evelyn offered the faintest smile. "You should have rested." A quiet laugh escaped him, gentle and filled with relief. "I was waiting." She looked at him more carefully then, noticing the weariness in his face and the unmistakable traces of tears that no amount of dignity could completely hide. The realization settled softly in her heart. This man, who carried an entire kingdom without complaint, had chosen to remain beside her through every uncertain hour. She tightened her fingers ever so slightly around his hand. "I'm sorry I worried you." Caleb slowly shook his head. "You never need to apologize for having a kind heart." Margaret quietly stepped into the hallway to give them privacy, but not before wiping another grateful tear from her cheek. Servants waiting outside noticed the smile on her face and instantly understood. Within minutes, quiet joy spread through Blackstone Palace. The physicians smiled with relief. The kitchen prepared warm broth and fresh bread. Even the palace guards standing watch beneath the gates seemed to stand a little taller. News traveled quickly through the kingdom that Lady Evelyn was recovering. No official announcement mentioned the long nights their king had spent beside her bed. No proclamation spoke of the tears he believed no one had seen. Yet those who had witnessed his quiet devotion carried the memory with them. They no longer saw only the calm ruler whose face rarely revealed emotion. They had seen something far greater. They had seen a man whose strength had never been the absence of feeling, but the depth of love he had kept hidden until the moment he believed he might lose the person who had quietly become the light within his silent world. Several weeks later, winter no longer felt harsh inside Blackstone Kingdom. Snow still covered the mountains, but laughter had quietly returned to the palace halls, and warm lights glowed from every window as families gathered together each evening. Evelyn had fully recovered, though Margaret still insisted on placing an extra blanket over her shoulders whenever the temperature dropped. Caleb never argued with the older woman. Instead, he simply smiled faintly whenever Evelyn laughed about being fussed over. The people of Blackstone noticed something had changed as well. Their king still carried himself with the same quiet dignity. He still rose before sunrise, inspected bridges after storms, visited villages without ceremony, and listened carefully to every concern brought before him. Yet now, whenever Evelyn accompanied him through the marketplace or across the palace gardens, there was a warmth in his silver eyes that had never been there before. He no longer walked through life entirely alone. One clear morning, the central square filled with citizens celebrating the completion of new homes and a larger village clinic that would serve families throughout the Northern Territory. Caleb stood before the gathered crowd with Evelyn beside him. The applause slowly faded as one elderly villager stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Your Majesty," he said. "For many years people called you the strongest alpha they had ever known." Caleb listened quietly. The old man glanced toward Evelyn before continuing. "Now we know why." Soft laughter spread through the crowd. Caleb looked at Evelyn, then back toward the people who had trusted him for so many years. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. Strength is not measured by how much a person can carry alone. It is measured by how faithfully we care for one another when life becomes difficult. He reached for Evelyn's hand without hesitation. "This kingdom has always been my responsibility." She reminded me that it is also my home. The crowd answered with warm applause, not because they had witnessed a grand royal speech, but because they recognized the simple truth within his words. From that day forward, the stories told around fireplaces slowly changed. Travelers no longer spoke only of the quiet Alpha King who ruled with discipline and wisdom. Parents told their children about the ruler who personally delivered hope to forgotten villages, who believed kindness did not need applause, and who stayed beside the woman he loved through every uncertain hour until she smiled again. The old legends were not erased. They simply became incomplete without the new ending. And whenever the first snowfall returned each winter, people smiled as they remembered that even the coldest season could never silence a heart willing to love with. Quiet devotion. If this story reminded you that true strength is found in compassion, loyalty, and kindness, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next journey. Leave a like if you believe love can soften even the strongest heart. Share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and tell us in the comments. At what moment did you realize Caleb had loved Evelyn all along? And what lesson from their story will stay with you the longest?